So you heard some of the questions I asked Fulton about the view of Latin American governments towards a sanctioned country like Russia that's public enemy number one of the United States government and, frankly, the governments of Western Europe as well. Their view of their trade relationships with a country like China, their view of the crisis in the Middle East between the Israelis, the Palestinians, and the Arab states, their view of, I didn't get into this specifically, but their view of pariah states like North Korea or Iran, how they're willing to interact and engage with those countries on a basis of neutrality. I think it's very interesting to see that these countries have made very clear that they want an alternative to the United States because they don't trust having all their eggs in that basket. The long-term policy of the U.S. has been all over the place, zigzaggy, as Fulton said, sort of up and down. And while there would be a preference to have close relations with the U.S., so close that formalized alliances, potentially even defense alliances, would make a lot of sense, the idea that the United States has such a strong alliance with its North Atlantic partners in NATO, in Europe, and doesn't have a similar strong, well-known alliance in Latin America is pretty interesting, given that this is so much closer to home in so many ways, and given the potential of both security benefits as well as trade relations and free movement of goods, services, and people. It's interesting that the U.S. has a much closer formalized relationship across the Atlantic Ocean with its Western European partners than it does with those who are just on the other side of the border in Mexico or on the other side of the Gulf of Mexico in Latin America, Central America, South America, the Caribbean. All of this to say that you can tell that these regions, the countries in this region, they're looking at the just-in-case scenario. They want to know what happens if the U.S. truly disengages from international trade relationships, from international geopolitical commitments, from foreign policy commitments. They want to make sure that if you're sitting in a capital in Brazil or Argentina or Colombia, that not only are you thinking about relations in your neighborhood, but you're thinking about potentially America's rivals. And if the U.S. isn't going to play an active role in your part of the world, then perhaps you turn to China for things that you would have otherwise turned to the U.S. for. Perhaps you're willing to do business with a sanctioned country like Russia, even if it pisses off the United States Embassy in your capital. Perhaps you're willing to flirt with business relations with a country like Iran, despite its state sponsoring of terrorism in the region, including targeting U.S. troops in countries like Iraq. Perhaps it means you're willing to have controversial relationships with countries openly hostile to the United States, well, governments that are openly hostile to the U.S., like those in Nicaragua, like those in Venezuela, like those in Cuba. Perhaps you are preparing for a world in which the United States is not as much of a factor, and whether you'd like to be engaging with those countries or not, for the benefit of your own people, you feel a need to do so. So when I look at Latin America and I think about the issues that are being faced in those countries, they're not really that different from issues being faced in other democracies. If anything, the part of the world is much more stable than it has been historically, despite challenges, particularly in Venezuela. But it is a region, I should say, as I said at the end of the last episode, that has so much hope and so much promise. There are so many compelling stories and businesses and leaders and communities. There's every reason to believe that Latin America could have a renaissance economically, socially, culturally, that propels it to a top producer in the world, that allows it to have the kind of economic power collectively that the European Union has, or certain countries in Southeast Asia when they act collectively have. But the challenge here is, as much hope and optimism as there is, the force that is most likely to bring those together and to help realize that potential is the superpower in their own backyard, the United States. If the U.S. is not interested in doing that, the likelihood is that the individual countries that have economies of note are likely to simply expand their trade relationships with many of America's rivals, deepening the challenges the U.S. may have in retaining its top spot in the world economically, and allowing countries like China, like Russia, like Iran to have closer relations closer to America's border, which can cause security challenges in the future and potentially difficult conversations between the American government and those in Latin America.